So let's get started. When I was trying to think of the perfect person to lead off our series on Earth Day, I immediately thought of Rebecca McMackin. I mean, she is an enthusiastic ambassador for ecological gardening. She spent 10 years as the Director of Horticulture at the beautiful and very nature-rich Brooklyn Bridge Park. And then she went to Harvard and became a Loeb Fellow and honed her message and communication skills up there. And now she works on many projects, including being the lead horticulturist for the American Horticultural Society. She is a naturalistic garden designer, author, and as I mentioned, she has a wonderful TED Talk that you should all search out. And she has an incredible monthly blog, which I look forward to every month. It's called Grow Like Wild. She has over 10,000 subscribers. And it's an incredibly rich resource for different articles and useful information on ecological gardening. We'll drop a link to become a newsletter subscriber in the chat for that. So I urge you all to check that out. So without any further ado, let's welcome Rebecca McMackin. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for that lovely introduction and happy
Uh,
birthday.
Thank you. You too. Where are you joining us from?
I'm in rural Connecticut. So I grew up here and then moved to New York City. I'll talk a little bit about that, but I lived in New York for the vast majority of my life and just moved back here a few months ago.
Nice. And how's your garden growing?
Not quite yet, you know. We moved into a 200-year-old house, and so we're just finding out, what's really here. And I'm excited to report that there's a vast daffodil collection. We've counted 25 different cultivars of daffodils so far. So it's really fun explorations like that.
Nice. Well, that sounds exciting.
It is.
Well, let's do it. I'm going to turn it over to you and hide my mug and let you take control and give us this wonderful. I'll see you after.
Sounds good. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and give it a full screen. Thank you for everybody coming on such a beautiful day. I feel bad asking anyone to be inside on this gorgeous day. The only consolation is that maybe it's too hot to be outside, and it's nice to sit inside for the evening. But happy Earth Day. It is a hard Earth Day, I've got to say. It's a difficult day, a difficult time to be people who care about plants and animals, as we all are. Which, from my perspective, that the sort of seriousness of this moment really makes our work so much more important. And that includes the work of the Highline, the work of Brooklyn Bridge Park, the work of everyone cultivating biodiverse ecosystems in cities, outside of cities, really everywhere. If we care about ecology, if we care about biodiversity, the reality right now, I think what's really becoming apparent to me is that we cannot rely on the government to do that work for us and that we have to just do it ourselves. And that means funding environmental organizations, protecting the habitat that still exists, and what I'm going to talk about today, which is cultivating beauty and biodiversity on the land that we're caring for. It can be sometimes, quite frankly, a little ridiculous to focus on gardening when the world is in this sort of free fall. But I want to make the case today that right now, amidst all of that, that gardening is more important than ever, especially in cities like New York, but also, of course, in forests and on farmland and in suburbia and really literally everywhere. I spent most of my life in New York City, as I said, but I grew up on a small farm in the woods of Connecticut, and I grew up gardening. My mom started me gardening when I was 6 years old, but I did not know at the time that it was a real job. And I always thought that real life was like something you go and do elsewhere. And so, like many rural kids, I got out of there the moment I could drive and spent a very wild youth working in art and fashion and then ecology. But I never really fell in love with anything until I found horticulture. And it was urban ecological horticulture specifically. So I moved to New York City and I worked there for most of my career, cultivating beautiful and biodiverse landscapes on public lands in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. I was head gardener for historic Washington Square Park in Manhattan, which is, of course, beautiful, but also has such a rich cultural history, and still to this day remains the center of political action in New York City. Just about every protest march ends there for a rally, and it was at that park that I became a dedicated public servant, recognizing the role that stewards play in holding and shaping these critical spaces for democracy. This is the day after the It Gets Better rally in 2010. Some of you might be too young to remember it, but the nation was just waking up to the horrifying levels of self-harm among queer and gender nonconforming children. And there was this big movement to let them know just to hang on until they get old enough to move to a city, essentially. And the park was covered in rainbow graffiti of love and anger. And I just remember staring at this Zelkova covered in rainbow glow sticks, who I'm sure had never felt so fabulous in its short life, and thinking this job was so important and ridiculous and absolutely wonderful. And then I went to Brooklyn Bridge Park, where I worked for a decade, helping to build and run this massive public works project, the largest in Brooklyn in over a century, turning these derelict shipping piers into a world-class public park. The designers of the park, Michael von Valkenburg and Associates, always intended it to provide habitat to New York City wildlife, as well as habitat for New York City people. And so the designers would hike mountains in the region and look at rock faces and trail slopes, and then assess the views that people were drawn to in natural settings. And then they brought all of that back and shaped Brooklyn Bridge Park to give urban people similar experiences. So for instance, New York City can be oppressively flat, so they put in many hills for kids to run up and down, and paths that would give people the experience of exploring a woodland path in a safe and accessible way. And the hope is that animals might do the same thing, that they'd recognize this construction as real land. And in many ways, Brooklyn Bridge Park, similar to the High Line, is an experiment in constructed ecology. As director of horticulture, I recognize this as the best possible laboratory in which to track and support biodiversity, as well as to pull lessons from the process and share what we learned with other institutions trying to do similar things. The whole project was so much more successful than I think any of us ever dreamed. The park hosts more than 5 million people every summer, and the Hort crew, led by Rashid Polson, is now up to over 20 people, including arborists, interns, and a fleet of gardeners/ecologists who care for the landscape, but also conduct experiments. They observe how animals, plants, and people all interact there together in the largest city in the country. And it really seems to be working incredibly well. The park has attracted rare birds, endangered plants, and critically imperiled bumblebees like Bombus fervidus here. This is the great golden bumblebee. And I love to tell the story because so many people think of cities as ecologically destitute, and that is absolutely not the case. And it's even kind of a problematic opinion to have at this point. Cities are just very different ecologically than surrounding regions, but they play very, very important roles. Here is the same bee, Bombus fervidus, on the High Line. So incredibly rare, but somehow very happy in these flower-filled urban parks. And when you look at the distribution on, this is called iNaturalist, this is this amazing website, you can see that there is a population of Bombus fervidus in New York City. They're clustered around there, and one in Pennsylvania, in Philly. This is an urban bee. Researchers explain this distribution by suggesting that Bombus fervidus is incredibly sensitive to the pesticides used in suburban and rural areas, as well as diseases from agriculturally managed bees. So cities, for these guys, are actually a refuge from toxicity. And when we look at an aerial image of New York City, the main thing that I notice here is all of that gray, right? All of the impervious surface, and just what poor design this is for people and animals and plants and fungi, all of us. Currently, over half of humanity lives in cities, but that number is expected to hit 2/3 in just 5 years, according to the UN, when the world population is expected to hit 9.7 billion. These cities are the sites of the most people living under extreme density with the most severe environmental erasure, which can be read as a dangerous tragedy or as the site of just transformational potential. Healthy ecology matters for people as well, People have the right to live in a thriving and verdant ecosystem. There was a study out of Finland a few years ago where they took all of these daycares and ripped out a bunch of concrete right around them and put in gardens. They put in little forests, they put in raised beds, and encouraged the kids to just dive in there and get dirty. And they saw the immune system function of all of those children skyrocket within just a matter of weeks. It was incredible. Similarly, there was a study out of Philadelphia from the Urban Health Lab in which they took vacant lots in neighborhoods that were severely under-resourced and neglected, and they greened them and took care of them and put plants and made them into little pocket parks. And they saw gun violence in the vicinity of those parks go down by 29%. It is just absolutely astronomical. So I'm sure all of you have heard about the environmental impact of redlining, in which historically underserved, less wealthy neighborhoods with more people of color have less trees, less parks, worse air quality, and higher urban heat island effect than neighborhoods with wealthy white inhabitants. And the most egregious example of this that I've seen was a study out of LA in 2021 that found that the birds of LA were literally racially segregated, with diverse songbirds in historically white and rich areas of the city, and then pigeons and starlings dominating bird populations in poorer neighborhoods with more people of color. So there is a ton of work to be done. And honestly, truly amazing work is being done to repair these injustices for people, which is both wonderful and far overdue. But cities filled with plants and animals are also important for the plants and animals. New York City is along the East Atlantic Flyway for migratory birds. And I'm sure you all saw the report a few years ago that bird populations in North America are down 30% in the last 50 years, which is almost 3 billion birds just gone. And much of that is due to habitat destruction and climate change, and of course, drastically shrinking populations of insects, which are often the bird's main food source. But the point here is that with this chart is that wildlife are going to use our cities. They've lived on this land or traveled through this land for over 10,000 years. And so it's up to us to make cities less hostile to them. And when we do, it's better for people as well. As Robin Wall Kimmerer reminds us, all flourishing is mutual. And this was one of our main jobs at Brooklyn Bridge Park, to cultivate space for the pantheon of life on Earth at the center of the largest city in the country for everyone's benefit. Of course, one of the main tools that we used to do that were the plants themselves. The park is made up of mostly, but not exclusively, native plants, and we used only organic management practices. And we would research the life cycles of the animals and plants that we thought could thrive in the park, and then assess how our management practices interacted with them, and then, of course, adjust when necessary to encourage certain populations. Plantings in park areas were organized into what we call ecosystems, which sounds kind of hokey, but it's really the best term to describe a place like a freshwater wetland, which we had two of, or our many salt marshes. But the majority of the park consisted of this woodland edge plant mix that makes up a huge percentage of our managed landscapes in general, both in the city and out. We love these combinations of shrubs and trees and perennial plants. And this is what it looks like now, but it went in like this, as these tiny baby trees and a bunch of sun-loving perennials, which grew and grew and grew, and then completely shaded out all of the sun plants. And we essentially had to replant the majority of the understory of the entire park, which was a total pleasure. And we used a lot of surprisingly rough and tumble spring ephemerals, like this combo of Virginia bluebells and celandine poppy, which should be blooming right now on Pier 1 if you head there. And these plants are really rough and can handle, all kinds of the, things that urban plants have to handle. But then we would also plant these delicate little beautiful plants like this rue anemone around corners and behind rocks so that curious explorers could find them for themselves. But the way that we manage these plants, all of these plants, is a very different style of gardening than traditional formal horticulture. Normally, when a designer or a gardener plants a tree, it's with the expectation that one could return in 30 years and see it just as they left it, but possibly larger. In many gardens, that is the exact same for a clump of echinacea. At Brooklyn Bridge Park, we allowed for plant movement and growth and even death. We saw the beds more as systems that we were trying to kickstart so that the natural cycles of the plants could take over and become more or less self-sustaining, or at least self-regenerating. When a tree seeds in and a sapling begins to grow, that is an incredibly precious thing. In many cases, that sapling has a much better shot of living for a century than a tree that you would buy at a nursery. And so we would always try to prioritize that next generation whenever possible. Sometimes we'd end up with these tangled thickets that I think are beautiful, but the general public, it's not the High Line, right? No one stops to look at this. But they're still super important because birds will first look for structure, that dense structure to hide in, and only then will they start looking for food availability when they're selecting a place to forage or nest. And those thickets, those hedges in the park are absolutely perfect. So that was where we were coming from. But what I really want to share with you today are just some of the few techniques that we use to encourage all of this biodiversity, and more importantly, how we developed those strategies as well. So for example, we found Bombus viridis, and so we worked then with ecologists like Sarah Kornbluth to survey bee populations and then cultivate habitat for many of them. And so we found through those entomologists that bumblebees in our park often nested at the base of bunch grasses like this little blue stem. And so in the spring, you have to cut little blue stem back because if you don't, it'll rot or catch on fire, all these bad things. And so all the way on the left of the screen, that's our uncut little blue stem. All the way on the right of the screen is our normal little meatball that most people in horticulture make. But when you think about the bumblebees overwintering in at the base of these bunch grasses, we decided that what we would do is leave the layer of leaves right around the bottom, like in the middle slide here. We said we were leaving the skirts on and then being very careful not to step in those places, thinking about these sleeping bumblebees that we didn't want to disturb. And so we went through, we would have all these processes where we would try and support these wild bumblebees. And then, of course, and we didn't know where Bombus viridis was nesting. Nobody knew. And then one day, someone finally found it, and it was here in this pile of trash. And so you can do all of the work you want to support wildlife, but they have their own ideas, and sometimes it's literally just a pile of trash. And even though this one bee wants that, I do think that the level of really immediate diversification of the peers at Brooklyn Bridge Park was due to the land care practices that we used, because we kept on finding just these wildly charismatic animals who people love. Our work was definitely about creating functional habitat that was central, but it was also about introducing these animals to people and demonstrating how wonderful they can be. Brooklyn Bridge Park is one of only 4 locations in all of New York City to have populations of walking sticks. We had the first sighting of the 2-spotted lady beetle in New York City in 30 years as a result of not spraying the tiny, tiny aphids, which they feed on, and they're now spreading out to the rest of Brooklyn. And allowing these pests in the landscape was a big part of our work. In traditional horticulture, and which is sometimes even still taught today this way, it's often about maintaining a sterile environment that literally could never exist on this planet. It's just a myth. Our work at Brooklyn Bridge Park and many other ecological landscapes now is about building up biodiversity to the point that pests will just stay in check. Because when you plant a plant, what's really happened is that you've created a vacuum, which is a resource for herbivores, right? They eat plants, and they're going to eat your plant. And it's going to take a while for the predators to come in and arrive and keep those plant eaters in balance. And if you keep on wiping out those herbivores, you never get to that point. So what we do here is that here are these aphids that are on one of the swamp milkweeds. And rather than spraying them, even with organic soaps or oils, we first look and see if there are any predators or parasites in the area. And if you look, you can see these 2 big brown aphids. Those are aphid mummies, which means that those sad ladies have been parasitized by a teeny tiny wasp who has laid her eggs inside the aphids. And in just a few days, a mature wasp will emerge out of the back of the aphid, fly through the air, mate, and then lay hundreds of eggs in other aphids and manage that population over time. And this is me standing in a patch of swamp milkweed in one spot without moving my feet at all and just taking photos with my iPhone of aphid predators. And from the left to the right, we've got lacewing eggs, lacewing larvae, syrphid fly larvae, and ladybug larvae. So this is all of these, predatory animals are here in this population. And if I wiped out those aphids, I'd be wiping out all of those other animals as well. Sometimes with this whole approach, it's just necessary to accept a certain level of pest and disease, right? These are not sterile environments. This is cedar quince rust and it got on the surface berries and it just is what it is. We lose some berries every year. And there is an important perspective that fungi and diseases are part of our ecosystem. And they're also doing important jobs like thinning out weak genetics and cycling nutrients. Doug Tallamy has this hilarious 10-step approach to dealing with plant diseases, where you just take 10 steps back away from the plant. And if you can still see it, then it's a problem. But otherwise, it really isn't. And so a lot of this is just a shift in perspective, right? And a desire to stop micromanaging everything. I personally think these Taxodium midgalls are super ornamental and they're cool. They tell a story of the landscape. And this is a monarch caterpillar up on the highline. When we are encouraging biodiversity, one of the most important things we can do, just like all of those thousands of plants that came in from Glover, is make sure that they are not treated with systemic insecticides like neonics. If you are planting native plants, if you're planting any plants, you should make sure, you should talk to your nursery, talk to the store where you're buying them, make sure they're not treated. These insecticides are inside the plants, they don't wash off. And they make it so that any animal that eats a seed, visits a flower, chews on a leaf, all of that is either seriously harmed or actively killed. And they're bad for birds as well, and us, of course. And so it's just this very, very important thing. If you are working with these plants, it's like a poisoned apple, right? If you put this out, you're drawing in animals to it, and it can be quite dangerous. So just make sure before you start doing this work to always make sure that there's no neonics in it. Sometimes we would go after very specific species that we wanted in the park and try and figure out how to attract and support them, like fireflies. I had been working in the park for about 7 years or so, and we noticed that we had a few fireflies at that point. So I researched what sort of habitat and food resources that fireflies require. And I shared that information with the hort staff and requested that everyone find locations in their zone where we could leave wet leaves, which is what the fireflies want. They want to live in wet leaves all year round without impacting the design or like watering a pile of leaves, which we didn't want anyone to do. And one of the gardeners, Pavel Plyazinski, who is just an incredible naturalist, he left a bunch of wet leaves in his wetland area, and it took a couple of years, but we got to the point where we had a firefly population so spectacular that people would come and put down picnic blankets to watch the show in July. And I highly recommend for all of those of you in New York City to make sure that you catch that. So we learned a lot about planting and design and the way that those two activities really foster habitat. But as stewards of that land, what we focused on and what was a bit of a revelation for us, which was how much garden management dictates the quality of habitat in a landscape. That it's not just the species or the arrangement of plants, although they are central, but it's the way that we conduct ourselves in the garden that dictates if a ground nesting bird, for instance, will nest or if specialist pollinators will be able to reproduce. And at that time, like years and years ago, when I first started gardening in the city, we called working in the garden maintenance. We were maintaining the garden. And we soon realized that this is just not an accurate term to do the sort of work we were doing. We were not maintaining anything. These were very active and dynamic systems. And so we moved over to use the word management. And that word gives the landscape a bit of agency, and it made a bunch of gardeners feel super important for a while. But it's still a little bit corporate for my taste, or like managing something. And so now a lot of people use stewardship, and the reality is that I use all of these words pretty much interchangeably, but the word that I always go back to is care. We are taking care of land with this sort of work. We're not just imposing our will, but we're considering what the land wants to be and what the ecological communities and human communities need in order to thrive. More than anything these days, I think about this type of gardening as simply an incredibly pretty way to take care of land. And I love this framing because it puts us in the landscape, not just over it. And we can be actors and helpers and friends of birds. I think a lot of people have a pretty bleak opinion of humanity these days. And I like to remind us that the problems that we're facing are not due to our species necessarily. Biodiversity decline is the result of a very specific set of practices and views that we can change. The sorts of extractivist, consumerist, colonialist relationships to land that so many of us grew up with do not need to be what we carry into the future. We can protect the ecological diversity that remains, cultivate it on our land, and even build it when necessary. And a lot of that centers around the protection and planting of native plants. These are plants that evolved on the land that we're working on and alongside, and sometimes at the behest of local wildlife. Researchers have determined that for a managed landscape to function ecologically, they should have a minimum of 70% native plants. I usually go for 80%, but that remaining 20% leaves so much room for like my grandmother's lilacs and daffodils and whatnot. Because making as much space as possible for native plants is really central to this work. We use them as building blocks, as the bases for the systems that we're trying to support, with the intent to lure back the animals and fungi who have relationships with those plants. So you might go outside and you might see a lilac, and then there's a bee on that lilac, and you think, this is great. That's a healthy ecological system. And that bee might be perfectly happy, but possibly not. In the US, a full quarter of our bees are specialists, which means that they need the pollen of very specific species or genre or families of plants in order to provision their babies. They gather up a ball of pollen and they feed that to their babies. And when that pollen isn't available, they will often forage elsewhere, and sometimes they suffer in ways that we can't see. The larvae could be smaller, they could be fewer, or they might not develop at all. So it's important to remember that we're not just feeding bees, right? That's not really our goal. We are only now discovering the true complexity of pollen and nectar and the way that animals use them. There was a study a couple of years ago that found that bumblebees will self-medicate with sunflower pollen to clear out gut parasites. And they found that it's actually the shape of the pollen that does it. It's like really spiky. And nectar is a veritable witch's brew with alcohol and yeasts and amino acids that pollinators rely on. In Eastern North America, our ruby-throated hummingbirds will visit many flowers. I'm sure you've all seen it. But only these tubular red and yellow flowers that they evolved alongside of contain nectar curated just for them, with the viscosity and sugar content and amino acids necessary to sustain their extreme energy use. Same with berries. In the United States, studies have shown that our native songbirds prefer native berries. But newer research also shows that when compared to invasive species, native fruits have the nutritional value that birds require in order to keep them healthy. The birds have selected fruit with high lipid concentrations for millennia. We focus our efforts in the ecological horticulture community. We focus our efforts on supporting these pre-existing relationships between species. They're ecological communities, and rather than trying to create new ones or establish new ones. And then, of course, there are the lepidopterans, which are butterflies and moths. And you might see them visiting flowers in your garden where they happily drink nectar, and that's wonderful. But if you want them to reproduce, you have to provide the plants that they evolved alongside of, their host plants. There absolutely are instances where lepidopterans have figured out how to use exotic species and sometimes even prefer them to natives, but those are the rare, rare exception. They are not the rule. The safest thing to do is to make sure that these animals have access to the plants that they rely on. And again, it's just about keeping these communities intact because this work is it's also just like not only about the animals, right? We always focus on that, but we want the plants to thrive as well. And many of them rely on pollinators and seed distributors, and they can suffer when those pollinators go someplace else. Purple loosestrife is a beautiful and ecologically damaging plant in the United States, and it pushes out native wetland plants. But pollinators absolutely love it, and they love it more than wildflowers. And a study a few years ago found that when researchers mowed purple loosestrife, pollination and seed production of native plants in the area went up drastically. Ecological gardeners strive to manage our landscapes not as a collection of objects or even individuals, right? They are systems that cultivate dynamics among whole networks of organisms. And of course, people are one of the most important communities to support when we're gardening. So please don't think I'm asking you to rip out your peonies or anything like that. Many of the plants that support wildlife can fit happily among or around plants that are from elsewhere and do not cause ecological damage. I've heard some people say that we've changed the land so much with climate change and urbanization that native plants no longer have a place in our cities. And that is simply not the case. There are plants for high and low pHs, for wet and dry conditions, for construction rubble, literally, you name it, we have the diversity. This is a garden that I designed for the front of the Brooklyn Museum. And these plants are in 18 inches of soil in one of the busiest intersections of Brooklyn with no gates or fences to protect them from New Yorkers and their dogs. And it still reads as ornamental. The goal was to lure people in with beauty and then sneakily introduce them to their regional ecology, plants included. And it's nonstop flowers from spring until frost. And I used many butterfly host plants and flowers that would attract charismatic pollinators. But still, for this garden at the front of one of the busiest museums in the country, it had to read as chic, right? It was also literally on the sidewalk in this major intersection. And so I selected for plants that I knew would be able to survive foot traffic and sidewalk salt while still reading as beautiful to people who were uninitiated, right? Who were just taking their kids to school or like a hot dog vendor. And so far, it's working incredibly well. This is its third year now, and we found more than 20 native species of bee recorded in this tiny little garden. And that was just in the first year alone. And some of them are even specialists. And again, I think this is due to the planting and design choices, but also the way that the garden is cared for. The gardeners taking care of this land have been trying on a tiny, tiny scale to implement many of the practices that we used at Brooklyn Bridge Park. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the Leave the Leaves movement by now. And if you have land, I hope you're doing it. It's so important. It's just in every possible way. It's funny, but I think that the reason why that campaign Leave the Leaves is so successful is because it has a cute slogan. And so I think we need more marketing people in horticulture, if any of you are marketing people, because it's so important. Because the more we can shift gardens and landscapes over to looking and behaving like they do in the natural world, the better habitat they can provide. Leaves are a much better mulch than anything you can buy in a bag. They are what your plants want to grow in. Your plants literally put the leaves there so that they can grow in them. And there's this funny idea still floating around that deciduous trees will just throw their leaves away in the winter. But the reality is that they are carefully placing those leaves over their root systems, where the leaves break down and soil organisms then recycle them and reintegrate those nutrients over the next season. And it's sort of like a slow motion carbon fountain where the leaves go down from the tree into the soil, the nutrients get taken back up through the roots, back into the tree over and over and over. And those leaves are providing starches and complex molecules, and they feed the microorganisms that feed the plants. The plants are using the leaves to build the soils that they want to live in. A lot of gardeners have it backwards, thinking that we're making soils for our plants, but the plants are making the soils for themselves. And we just, of course, get to benefit from that. If you drive outside of the city and you see a juniper in the middle of a grassland, it's not an uncommon sight. Most trees and shrubs cannot grow in grasslands because they like different things, but juniper is always right out there, right in the beginning of a meadow or a pasture or an old field. And if you dug a hole right underneath that juniper, you would find soil pHs that are orders of magnitude more acidic than if you walk 20 feet away from the tree and dig a hole there. And that is because that juniper is using all of the tools at its disposal. It's using root exudates and needle castings in order to change. It's literally terraforming the soil to lower the pH, to create a more fungal soil community, because that's what it wants. And then other trees and shrubs can then take advantage of that. And then that's how succession literally happens in the Northeast. And so ecological gardeners will look for ways to leave the leaves as well as all of the plant material that we possibly can. And that is helpful for the plants, but it also helps us. The leaves in an oak forest can hold virtually all of the water from a 2-inch downpour. They also slow down water sheeting off a landscape and allow it to percolate into the soil. As they break down and humus moves into the soil, carbon is sequestered. A study from the University of Maryland found that in gardens where leaves hadn't been removed, soils held on average 32% more carbon. But most relevant here is that so many animals have come to rely on those leaves and the humus just beneath them as habitat. And we call that area between the soil and the fresh leaves, we call that the duff layer. And we go to great lengths to preserve it because when you rake it out, even if you're just going to compost it, you're literally raking out a bunch of animals, like this beautiful polyphemus moth at Brooklyn Bridge Park who overwinters as a cocoon, camouflaged as a leaf, and you would never notice them if you rake those leaves away. Bumblebees and pearl crescent butterflies will also overwinter in the leaves, and they're often in northern climates. They go underneath the snow in this layer of trapped heat called the subnivean zone. And it's such a cool, it means under the snow, right? Subnivean. And what happens with that is that the heat of the earth will melt the snow that is directly above it. And those grasses and twigs and leaves kind of create a little room and hold the snow above it. And if you get 6 inches of snow, that little space, the subnivean zone, never gets below freezing. So it's insulated. And it's a very active biological zone as a result of that. And it's structural, right? It doesn't matter which plants you use to make it. It's about that structure. And this is a hillside at Brooklyn Bridge Park that we were in the process of reclaiming from weeds through solarization and then sodding with a native fescue sod. And you have bindweed and mugwort on one side, on the right side, and then the new sod on the left side. And if you were a beetle, which side of this hillside would you want to be on? You would want to be on the weedy mess, right? Because all of that structure, all of that messiness, that creates wonderful habitat. There's places to hide, there's insulation, there's microclimates, and then the grass is just a sheet. You would get eaten. There's vast temperature fluctuations. There's no humidity. And that habitat of just a blank slate is very similar to the sort of sheets of brown mulch that many of us make in our gardens that are just a flat plane. And so again, the more we can cultivate that messiness, the better it is. It is that messy duff layer is really teeming with life. And of course, many of the animals in that duff layer are not as charismatic as moths, like ants and beetles, but they're still super important, even though they're not always well loved, because they drive ecological networks by providing food to birds like this oven bird. And birds like this will only hang out on your land when you have insects in the leaves for them to eat. And as I mentioned earlier, these insects are in terrifying steep decline. A study came out last month or 2 months ago now from Science that said that US butterflies have declined 22% in just the last 20 years, right? And for all of arthropods, all insects and spiders, et cetera, entomologists estimate that we've seen a global decrease of 45% in just the last 35 years, which is almost half of insect biomass from when I was 10 years old wiped off the face of the earth. Researchers also estimate that we're still losing from 1 to 2% per year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it adds up to an additional third of insects on the planet disappearing in the next 20 years. And so those are for all insects, but statistics for insects that are formerly abundant, those that we think of as very common, those insects are declining at a rate of 8% per year. And those are the insects who feed the birds, some of whom require 1,000 caterpillars a day to feed their young. Doug Tallamy calls caterpillars baby food because they're smushy and packed with protein. And they're one of the most important groups of insects to support when considering broader food webs. So not only do we need to stop losing caterpillars, we actually need to get that 22% back, and quickly. You might protest that leaving leaves would look really messy, and you'd be right. But is that tidiness really worth more than giant moths and songbirds? This is our house in Brooklyn, and I love the way this looks. Japan celebrates this, right? And we just rake it away. I still love the way it looks in winter at Brooklyn Bridge Park. For me, just aesthetically, this is better than a brown sheet of mulch. And this is what our land is supposed to look like in December. It provides a sense of place on earth. In a more formal environment, a foot or two of mulch along the front edge can clean the whole thing up. And when you keep that front of your garden really neat, when you give it a cue of care and let people know that it is not neglected, that you can still get away with a bit of benign neglect in the rest of the garden. And we call this the garden mullet. And to be clear, it's still a lot of work. We're not just walking away with romantic notions of letting nature take its course. Some herbaceous plants will grow happily through leaves, while others will literally faint and die if like 3 leaves get on them. And, leaves that harbor pests and diseases have to be removed. It's still quite a bit of work. But we also try to leave as much of the non-leaf plant material on the ground as possible, because we cut back the gardens in the spring, as mostly everybody does now, and not fall. And that is because that allows birds to eat the seeds if they're overwintering or passing through. And of course, other animals have places to hide. And but in the spring, we want those seed heads available to birds still, right? We don't want to get rid of them ever. Those same birds that came through in the fall needed the seed heads, they're coming back through in the spring and they need them. And so what we would do is to check the seed heads, see if there's any viable seeds, and then spread them out into the garden whenever we could. And then this is gardener Christina Severin, and she's demonstrating a practice called the chop and drop, where rather than cutting this panicum back from the bottom and raking all of that plant material away, she's cutting it down in 6-inch segments with her shears, and those little segments of grasses she just spreads around the base of the grass, and it looks really beautiful and is fast, and then it gives you instant mulch, and it looks, I think, again, a lot better than something like wood chips in this environment. Stems with a center or a pith of 1/8 of an inch or greater are left up 18 inches or higher. And that's so that stem nesting bees can use them in the following winter. So you leave them up forever. You never cut them down. That's some people get confused about that. But it's great because when those stems are up, they actually hold floppier plants like goldenrod. They give them some structure. And again, I like this. I think this looks fine to me. And Heather Holm, the entomologist who really popularized this strategy, she calls this stem stubble. And they're better than bee hotels, because bee hotels, when people drill holes in wood and put that in a garden, they can build up pests and diseases. And so these are so much better because eventually they just biodegrade. Certain asters at the park we would very carefully work around in order to protect the overwintering caterpillars that would overwinter at the base of those plants, like this tiny little pearl crescent. They overwintered as caterpillars, and so we would work around them very carefully. And as a result, one summer I counted 40 pearl crescents just flitting by like in a huge cloud. It was amazing. And of course, we were also in the process of interrogating why we cut back at all, and if it's really necessary functionally or even aesthetically. Many of our horticultural practices we learn to do just because it's what other people did. And often those other people lived in England 400 years ago and kept topiary. And so I try now to interrogate traditional garden practices and ask why these things are necessary. Certainly, some things really do need to get cut back for cleanliness or safety, or it really just looks that much better. But where we can, it really benefits everyone to find areas that we can leave untouched. And so I spoke about this in my TED talk that Richard mentioned. But a few years ago, Deputy Director of Horticulture Bella Ciabattoni, who was a gardener at the time, she had read that these beautiful hibiscus have many beneficial insects who live in the stems. And normally we just cut them down in spring and take those stems out of the park. And she asked me if we could leave the stems up. And we were always walking this really fine line between practices that supported wildlife and those that the public or my boss would read as too messy. And I was worried this would cross the line, but she said, let me give it a shot. Let me clean them up. And if it doesn't work, I'll just chop it down. And this is what she ended up with, which I think is just absolutely incredible. It is sculptural, it is evocative, and it brings silver and brown into the ornamental palette. And so I was just over the moon. And even if this isn't your thing, in just a few weeks after she did this, she found a song sparrow nest nestled in the base of those uncut stems. And then an actual baby bird hopping around outside of the garden just a couple weeks later. So it's incredible what these practices can result in. Similarly, Pavel left all of the milkweed in his zone uncut one spring, and I said, "You know what, Pavel, that looks really messy. You should chop that down." And it was right along the greenway and too high profile. And the next day, he sent me this video of a red-winged blackbird female stripping the milkweed to make her nest. And as it turns out, milkweed stems are renowned in the bird community for nest making because you can get these long, strong fibers with compounds that literally protect chicks from parasites. And birds like Baltimore Orioles will use them as well to weave these complex nests together. And so I let him leave them up. And why would I take that away from the birds? But also, what a gift to give this sight to an observant child walking by to see a bird make a nest. That to me is just worth so much more than a tidy aesthetic. And so a lot of this really is just controlling our impulses to tidy and to figure out how to make gardens look gorgeous without it. And so this is a newish trend, also popularized by Heather Holm, in which mulch tree rings are replaced with native ground covers. And she calls them soft landings because they provide a place for all of those moths and caterpillars that live in tree canopies, which is quite a lot. Most of them will travel down into the leaf layer, into the duff layer in order to pupate or overwinter. At some point of their life, they go down into the soil. If you've ever seen like a tiny green caterpillar hanging from a silken thread, they're on their way down. And this is a very utilitarian soft landing. It is on a lawn in the Rose Kennedy Greenway in Boston, and it's getting hammered by the public. But this is one that I designed in Brooklyn Bridge Park, and it essentially does the exact same thing. And so, what we're all trying to do right now is to find ways to design and cultivate ecologically functional landscapes that also read as incredibly beautiful to the uninitiated. Many of these plants can go between shrubs as well, rather than mulch. And Pete O'Dolph once said to me that Americans like to display their mulch. And he is sadly right, but I'm so glad that that is changing. And we're finding ways to sneak host plants for butterflies and flowers for specialist bees in areas that would have, until recently, been maintained as a vacuum to just mulch in perpetuity. And so these green mulch or soft landing plants can be highly ornamental, like this Brooklyn Bridge Park garden that was designed by gardener Junko Fujimoto. And she has big drifts of phlox and Jacob's ladder, and it's one of my favorite places in the whole park. We're also always working on this 1 to 2 foot tall green matrix that could be used as an understory all over the park in dry shade. This one is by horticulturalist Evelyn Manlove, and it is super diverse and it can grow through those fallen leaves in the spring. And it's made up of dynamic plants with different reproductive strategies who could hold their own and like fill in gaps. Anytime a gap appeared, they could just like move into that space. And it can result in a sort of gridlock of stability. And this was my front garden in Brooklyn with this cute matrix of short plants around shrubs. And it's the exact same thing. And this is a garden, it's underneath an oak tree. And I had to pull out like 50 oak seedlings every year. And aside from that, I do literally nothing. This garden just always looks like this. And so those were just a few of the practices that we found to be the most helpful. And of course, they may or may not be relevant where you work. So I thought I could share the method that we use to develop those strategies because every garden is different and caters to different plants and wildlife communities. And so it's pretty simple, right? We would just essentially stock our wildlife. We would pick an animal who either frequented the park or one who we wanted to attract and research their life cycle. And then we'd figure out what they need for food and water and seasons and reproduction, nesting material, all of that, and then see if we could provide those resources. And sometimes it was as simple as just leaving them alone, and often it involved planting native plants. So for example, the painted lady butterfly, this one, was a regular visitor, and we had a few of their host plants, but I wanted to test all of them. So I ordered this silver plant called Pearly Everlasting, and immediately upon opening the box, butterflies just absolutely mobbed us. And this is a video of me trying to plant one of the plants, and this lady would not stop laying eggs. We had to brush the butterflies off the plants just to get them into the ground. And I told this story as very uplifting in my TED Talk, and everyone loved it. But what I didn't tell them is that we planted in spring, and as the caterpillars hatched, they ate all of the leaves and all of the plants, and then all of the plants died, and then all of the caterpillars died. And so it was an absolute tragedy. And we learned that we should plant the plants in the fall moving forward so that they could get established first, and then before the caterpillars came to eat them, and everything was fine moving forward. But honestly, one of the best parts of that talk was that it inspired hundreds of people to go out and plant Pearly Everlasting and then attract the butterfly. And then so many of them ended up emailing me to tell me about it. And it was truly such a joy because the process can really be radicalizing to see the way that each one of us can be helpers and caretakers of our ecological communities. And anytime we discovered anything like this, we would add it to one of our massive databases, and they're all available on the Brooklyn Bridge Park website. And we would record anything and everything that we researched and observed and that we thought was relevant. And so there's these great databases on butterflies and weeds and native plants for tough situations. And they're hard, they're massive, and they're working databases, so they're super rough. But if you do this kind of work and you're not scared of a big database, they're really helpful. I also will disseminate this information in my newsletter, which when I have time to write it, which is hopefully once a month, is filled with resources and research. Similarly, we wanted ruby-throated hummingbirds in the park because, of course, they're magical. And so we planted every red and yellow tubular flower native to the region, hoping to attract them. And it took 7 years, but eventually they showed up on this jewel weed that Pavel planted, and they love it, and it's beautiful. And the jewel weed is still considered a weed and removed in most landscapes, which is bonkers because it literally has blue leaves and these beautiful flowers, and then the seed pods will explode and delight every child and most adults as well. And so, we have the flowers for them, but we also leave the seed heads of Virginia Anemone virginiana up because I read that the hummingbirds will use the floss of this plant to weave together their nests of lichen and spider silk. And they haven't nested in the park yet, but we just leave this up as an invitation. We never cut it back. So again, we're just supporting these communities however we could. And the most central community that here, of course, are the gardeners themselves. And so I just want to state clearly if it wasn't already, that this was the work of a bunch of people, and it was just my job to talk about it. And when I think of all of the things that we accomplished at Brooklyn Bridge Park, the one I am most proud of is having led this incredible team and created a good place to work, where people feel respected and have room to follow their own interests. And that sounds so obvious. Like, of course, everyone should have that. But in our culture, manual labor has been systematically and strategically devalued, so that it actually becomes quite radical to say, these jobs are important, you are doing valuable work, and we're going to pay you well and treat you with respect. Because you cannot order someone to chase around a butterfly, but you can educate and inspire and provide space for them to follow their own passions. You might wonder why we focus so much on butterflies, and it is because everybody loves them. I personally happen to prefer moths, but butterflies are a gateway insect. And they so clearly and beautifully illustrate the possible functionality of our gardens. And the reality is that everyone wants butterflies around, but you just don't get butterflies without the caterpillars, and you don't get the caterpillars without the host plants. And we don't need to pick between butterflies or people, because Brooklyn Bridge Park sees more than 5 million people each summer, and almost none of them have any idea that any of this work is happening. The wildlife and the people fit together seamlessly. I struggle sometimes with this work and with doing it now, especially during climate change and unabashed imperialism and our seeming descent into open barbarism. But I've concluded that gardening and landscapes have a serious role to play in bringing about the world that we all want to see. This photo is from June of 2023 when Brooke Klausing and I returned to the Brooklyn Museum after having planted it just a couple of months before. And we should have been overjoyed at the blooming penstemon, but on that day, you could not see the sun and the air smelled like fire. It was the second day of the effects of the Canadian wildfires finding their way to New York City, and it was absolutely apocalyptic. Even though people were still using the garden and they took care of their kids and they looked at flowers and they drank coffee. And I counted 5 species of native bees in the smog, and it was all just super surreal. And I thought that day that we should all just quit our jobs and go do something that more directly upped our chances of planetary survival. I literally started arguing with my friends about it. And I eventually got so upset that I called my husband, Chris Roddick, who was the head of arboriculture at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden for 30 years. And he is a super grounded guy. And he reminded me that outside of the Cherry Blossom Festival, the single busiest week that he ever saw at the garden was the week after 9/11. Because gardens get more important when the world is on fire, not less. They are our sanctuaries, same as they've always been, and they can be sanctuaries for bumblebees too. And so I will end it on that note. Thank you all so sincerely.
Rebecca, that was amazing. Thank you for that reminder. We had a very nice day here in New York City on Saturday, and we hit a record attendance on the High Line. We had almost 40,000 people.
Incredible.
Yeah,
Incredible.
and I think, yes, it's spring. Yes, there's so much going on, but I think you're absolutely right in the fact that gardens really can be, we support biodiversity, we support habitat, we support animals, and we support people because there are species that really need support.
And I think that it works best when everyone's all together as well. That
Yes.
this idea of conservation, this idea of environmentalism, where you separate people out of the picture, that is antiquated. It is an anachronism at this point. That we should recognize the role that people play in supporting ecology and embrace that role.
Well, and access to nature has just been proven to have such great health effects for people. I'm so lucky. I live near Central Park. I start my day in Central Park, looking at nature, looking at the herons in the pond. And I always said I wanted to live somewhere where I could walk out my door and be in nature, walk with my dog. I just didn't realize I was going to do that in the middle of New York City. But it's, nature's everywhere. There's,
Totally.
that dandelion in the crack of the sidewalk is potentially supporting some pollinators. So, it's just about getting your nature eyes on no matter where you are.
I really believe that that cities should be managed in such a way that people don't need to go to a park necessarily, although of course they are like we want them to come to our wonderful parks as well. But that sort of sense of a verdant, lush environment should be what is outside of everybody's house, that they all should feel those feelings, hear those bird songs. There was a study just last week that came out that was looking at hundreds of thousands of nurses. This is like this really long running study where they've looked at nurses and studied everything about them for decades and decades. And they looked at rates of depression in this cohort, and then access. They looked at all of them on Google Maps and looked at how many trees were around their house. And they found that for these nurses, the closer they were to trees and the more trees they had, the less depressed that they were. It literally just makes them happy to be around trees. And everyone deserves that, right?
So we have a couple questions. I know we're running past 7 o'clock. We're going to answer questions for a few more minutes, and I know that some of you may need to log off, but know that it will be recorded if you want to visit this later. But hopefully you can stick around because this is often the funnest time to really get a chance to get some additional information. First of all, I just want to say the Bombus fervidus needing the city because it's the safe place to be away from pesticides, I thought was the most compelling thing I've ever heard for really maintaining habitat in the city. What a
Yeah.
great, are there any other insects or animals that kind of benefit from an urban environment?
I mean, yes, of course, but they're not usually the ones we like.
Right. Well,
Pigeons, right?
yes.
Like
Okay.
the humble pigeon. But
Well,
this,
or the four-legged rodent that
of
we,
course, right?
yeah.
Those animals that have kind of moved around with humanity. But yeah, this is there are other instances, and so cities are environmental filters, right? For certain types of animals, and there's urban heat island effect. Cities have been shown to be hotter and drier than surrounding regions with more green space, more impervious surfaces, and so that's known. And so animals like butterflies and caterpillars, they have a harder time in cities because they are really sensitive to humidity and temperature fluctuations. And so cities can be limiting for lepidopterans depending on the species. But for bees, and Sarah Kornbluth, I'm sure we'll talk more about this in the next lecture. Bees don't mind as much. They do not mind the heat, the humidity. What they need is flowers.
Right.
And that is the limiting factor in cities, is that like a lack of flowers, a lack of stem nesting and soil availability for the soil nesters. They need the habitat for in order to live. And then they need this like abundance of floral resources in order to eat and then feed their young. And that in cities. And so there is absolutely a world in which we cultivate cities that are can fit all of us, right? It is a choice. I constantly think about how these things are design choices, and that like, yeah, you can look at a street tree and you can say that is, we can only plant ailanthus. We can only plant these three trees because they're the only ones that can live on the sidewalk, right?
Survive. Yeah. Right.
But the reality is that we're giving them like 4 square feet to live in and dumping a bunch of salt on them constantly. And so that's a design choice, right? That's a choice that we're making to put cars on all the streets instead of like big beds in order to plant plants and have bike lanes and all of that stuff. And so a lot of this stuff really can come down to better planning, better design as well.
Well, I think there is a movement too in the city now for creating more habitat and more gardens at the base of trees. Um,
Mhm.
it's really, I mean, talk about a tough environment, but I know we at the Highline have helped several of our local high schools plant some native gardens in some of their trees in their street.
Awesome.
And they seem to be maintaining. It's that soft landing idea. It's the heucheras and the caryxes and things like that. But it makes such a difference, to just get tremendous amount of square footage in the city that's available that way.
And the trees are happier when you do that as well. The trees are happier. And my husband, again, who's an arborist, like he does lectures on ecological arboriculture now. And he talks about how when you plant up those soft landings around trees, if you're planting a new tree and you're planting it for somebody else, like a homeowner, for example, they are so much more likely to water those new flowers than they
Mhm.
are to water the tree. And so it's actually, and that's what people see, a fainting flower. They're like, I gotta go water it. Whereas a tree is much less forgiving. And so it's a great way to support trees as well.
Speaking of trees, what what would be the like top three tree species that you'd plant to support Lepidoptera?
Oh, I mean, oaks, of course. Oaks are the big.
Butterfly. We're talking butterflies, right?
Yes,
Butterflies.
absolutely, absolutely. Butterflies and moths are also important and beautiful. Like there's
Yeah.
the Luna moth. Let's not forget about the gorgeous guys. But yeah, oaks are the big one, right? There, when you look at keystone species, if you just Google keystone species and you put in your zip code, I think that Homegrown
Oh,
National
right.
Park actually has a resource wherever you are that you can put in your zip code and they'll tell you what those keystone species are. And keystone species are plants that support an unusual amount of butterflies and moths and other wildlife as well. And so it is oaks, willows, and then cherries, I think are the top three. I think those are the top three on the list. I could be wrong, and one of them's four, and there's something else up there, but those are the three. And they're beautiful, right? They're just
Mhm.
amazing trees.
We have all three on the Highline. In fact, I was just showing someone today, we have bur oak trees growing on the Highline. They're 30 feet tall and they're growing in 18 inches of soil.
Incredible.
Yeah,
It's incredible. It's
yeah,
wonderful.
it's insane, but it happens. Um, I thought it was really interesting when you were reminding us about neonicotinoids, which are the pesticides that are, I can't remember, they really do impact bee species specifically,
Oh,
right?
yeah. And butterflies, they found that 33% of monarch decline is
Mm,
due to neonics
right,
specifically, right? So
right.
33%. So huge, huge impact, but also bees,
Yeah.
birds, children.
And probably you're more apt to run into those kind of infected plants in the big box stores. Those
Absolutely.
things are being grown, in such a quantity and pushed so fast that they're just not the healthiest of plants. I had John Little, who's an ecologist and a landscape designer who you probably know from England visiting, and he let me know this fact that just blew my mind, which is that the neonicotinoids and the flea medicine we're using on our pets that we're using as topicals or are getting rubbed off into the landscape and affecting water. A lot of the water features in England are evidently contaminated. And it was just like, it opened my mind to
It
just,
is insidious. It's everywhere. It's just everyone's like, "What's wrong? What is the one thing?" And it's like, "It's everything. It's all of it." It's like it's impossible.
I know, but at least we get to spend some time in the garden and that kind of brings us back to center. But it
Yeah,
made me think about how I treat my dog for fleas and
absolutely.
have to really look at this as the next, it's always something, right?
Yeah.
Um, I have a question. You had a blue leaf perennial under your oak that you planted. Was that jewelweed or what was that?
Oh no, that was Fadagia.
That was a
And
Fothergilla. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
that makes
love that plant. Blue, I'm a
beautiful.
glaucophile.
Yeah.
Anything blue, I'm just like right there. And yeah, that's the bluest plant.
But at the same time, doesn't Doug Tallamy tell us that
Oh, okay.
cultivars, yeah, cultivars of plants that have colored leaves are generally not as attractive to
So he hasn't told me about so glaucous foliage is most often it's either the result of many hairs or
yes.
wax, like a waxy
Yeah.
coating. Doug Tallamy's research and the research of other people really focuses on anthocyanins in foliage, which is what creates
Purple.
red, yes,
Yeah.
purple and red. So like penstemon husker red, right, versus the straight species. And that red pigment is a natural sunblock. It blocks radiation that could harm the plant, and so like lots of new leaves before they've developed protections will emerge as red. And they're also an insecticide. They stop the plants from, especially new little leaves, from being eaten by insects. And so often darker foliage plants they will be less attractive to wildlife or not able to be eaten. So, for example, turtlehead, tiny tortuga, or hot lips. Right, I love hot lips. It has like pink flowers with dark, dark green, almost black foliage. It's like so sexy. And I love it. And Doug told me personally that it was bad for the Baltimore checker spot. And so what I do now when I'm using it in a garden, I will still use that plant. I will put it in the front. I will have my, moment, and then I'll plant straight species turtle head all over the rest of the garden and kind of play with those different heights, different colors. I love that in a garden when there's like a bit of a color shift in the same species as well. So there's ways. I'm not one of those anti-cultivar people. There are so many of people out there, and they have very good arguments. But that's not me. I use lots of cultivars in order to, um, design gardens that work for people.
And it's interesting you were talking about the mix between native and non-native. You were saying kind of a 70-30, 80-20
Mhm.
mix. And it's funny, the Highline and the Pete Adolph, our garden designer on the Highline, always says, gardens are for people. So I use plants from all over because we need the blooms. But the reality is we have about 55% of the species are native, but
Mhm.
by biomass, we're probably at 80%.
Amazing. It's
Yeah,
amazing, right? And that's literally like the most beautiful garden in the world, arguably. It works, right? There
right,
is, I think that the idea that you have to sacrifice ornament or hedonism, right? Or
right.
just like overwhelming gorgeousness. I think there's this, sometimes people who work with native plants do it out of a sense of responsibility or like superiority sometimes. Like some people, we all know those folks. And the reality is that you can still just have it just be about normal gardening. It can just be gorgeous. And I think we can all do the work of noticing when gardens are both beautiful and ecological, and then pumping those images and styles out into the world and try and change those perceptions of beauty.
There's a question about what do you do if you inherit a garden with purchased mulch, even if it's a natural material? Do you leave it, or do you let the leaves and stems pile up on top of it, or do you remove it?
That really depends, right? Like I would, if it was like a dyed mulch, then that would be out of there. I would take that out. But if it was just like a triple ground bark mulch,
Yeah.
then I might, and it depends. It's like everything's so context dependent, but it was doing a job, right? Sometimes, like when we first put in a garden, mulch is doing a job. It's covering the ground and suppressing weeds so that those plants can grow in. That's an important job that mulch does, and you buy or make your own mulch in order to do that. But in a mature garden, in a perfect world, all of that space, right? Like all of that space should really be covered by plants. And so rather than raking it out, like I would suggest just planting right into it. And then trying to make sure that by June, that was usually my benchmark, that by June you couldn't see the ground, that everything was really filled in, unless you had specific spaces that you were trying to leave for ground nesting bees.
On the Highline, there was a design choice made to use gravel as
Mhm.
mulch because it recalled the look of the rails, the train lines. But it does, and Pete pointed this out, I evidently initially when they made the decision that, you need the birds to come in and rake through the mulch and eat, some of the pests that may be overwintering there. So the gravel does not make a really good, first of all, it interrupts the soil contact, so you're not getting the decomposition, and you're also not allowing the birds to get in and eat. We have beetle larvae and things like that that really can be a pest, so you need those kept in check.
So what do you do with all that gravel?
So it's been pointed out that you can, for a while, there was a let's keep it all neat and clean when the High Line first opened 15 years ago. Now we just let the leaves accumulate on top. And if they decomposed in such a fashion and you can see some gravel, then it's great. But it's really much more about, first of all, it's labor intensive to remove all the leaves, right? It's
Yeah.
such a great resource. We do have some magnolia leaves that we sometimes help chop up a bit because they are just
Of course.
really slow to break down. But yeah, for the most part, we're planting so densely that it's a green mulch. It's a living mulch.
That's awesome.
So we don't really have to deal with that much. Um, oh, someone's asking about rabbits. Any advice for rabbits?
We didn't have them at Brooklyn Bridge Park, but now where I moved in Connecticut, there is a family of rabbits that lives right outside, and we haven't started planting yet. So I'm still like in love with them. They're still so cute. And
Yeah.
in my imagination, we're going to plant and maybe protect some things with little, put plants in like plant jails with little cages. But my hope is that we can somehow plant enough that the rabbits can eat it, and that's fine. That there's a way to garden. And I could be hopelessly naive here. I know Nancy Lawson has written a lot about gardening alongside rabbits. I would check her out. And so I'm probably being very naive, but my hope is to figure out a way to like live with the rabbits and not just try and fend them off and protect the garden from them.
Yeah, I'm sure deer is the same situation too.
Exactly.
Right. Um, okay. Someone's asking to recommend, this will maybe be our last question. Can you recommend some resources for learning more about ecological horticulture?
Sure.
Yes, and the answer is, how much time do you have? We could go on and on about that, but go ahead.
I put resources every month in my newsletter, of course.
Right.
But also there are some good books. Like Kelly Norris just had a book that came out
Yeah.
on the naturalistic gardening. Do you remember what it's called? Oh, I don't remember.
No, but
All
it's
right.
great.
It's great.
Google
Everything.
Kelly Norris. Yeah.
And Claudia West has an incredible book called Planting in a Post-Wild World that is one of the best books on this stuff ever written. It's
And
fantastic.
her co-author, Thomas Rayner, is going to be our speaker in the third series.
Oh,
So,
hooray. Oh,
yeah.
that's so great.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect, perfect. He's fantastic as well. They do some of the best design work out there using these techniques. But yeah, it's hard because it's all gardening is local, right? It is all about what's happening outside. And so it's about observing. It's about doing that work of gardening, right? All gardeners are scientists. We're out, we're doing experiments, we're watching what happens and replicating experiments and all of that stuff. It's about doing that, but really paying close attention to the other animals as well.
Well, and just a couple of websites that you mentioned. One is Homegrown National Park, which is Dr. Doug Tallamy's project, along with, and I'm going to forget Michelle's last name, but it's a wonderful resource. You can turn your backyard into one of the members of the Homegrown National Park. The Highline is a member. I'm sure Brooklyn Bridge Park is as well. And Doug Tallamy is kind of the bringing nature home
Oh my
was, I
God.
think, his
Thank you.
first.
How could I
Yeah.
forget? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the other one I would mention, and when you were talking about how do we call what we do, and you were saying landcare, I immediately thought of Edwina von Gall and her organization, Perfect Earth, the Perfect Earth Project, I think, has great resources on ecological gardening. And it kind of stemmed from how do we take care of our lawns, but there's just some great information there as well. So I would visit both of those. And of course, the Brooklyn Bridge Park has that link that we put in has great information as well. And there is a horticulture celebration on the Highline that's talking about that subject. So come visit us all. And Sandra, our wonderful tech support, has got all of these links. Just as we're spitting them out, she's finding them on the interweb and sharing them in the chat. So that's amazing. Well, I want to thank you, Rebecca, for this amazing talk. It was a perfect way to kick off our virtual series. And I'm going to just scroll down here and remind everyone that we're saving the date for June 18th at 6 p.m. We have that wonderful program with Sarah Kornbluth and Sam Hoadley coming up in Pollinator Week. And of course, we'd love to hear any feedback that people might have about tonight's talk. We're going to be posting a link in the chat to an event survey. And that survey will also be going out in an email to you all after the fact as well. And of course, please come visit the Highline for our horticulture celebration. We'll have, I think, 40 plant garden signs throughout the park and some wonderful interpretive panels in our 14th Street Passage that'll talk all about the ways that we support ecological horticulture here on the Highline. And once again, thank you to Rebecca, who has really hopefully given us all a renewed vision for the steps that we can take as we think about gardens and public spaces that can be beautiful and support species, both animals and humans. And with that, I'm going to wish everybody another happy Earth Day. Hopefully there's still time for you to get out in your garden. If you have a garden, if not, go find some nature somewhere from wherever you are. And we'll see you next time here at the Highline. Thanks again.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye, y'all.